Hello everyone, this is your 2-minute mark. We will begin the webinar in approximately 2 minutes. This is also your audio check to make sure that your speakers are at a reasonable volume and that you can hear us. Again, thank you. Hello everyone, and welcome to Rotor Consulting's A Sixth Sense for Project Management on managing stakeholders for project success. My name is Christina Reed. I am the Assistant to the President here at Rotor Consulting and your host for today's webinar. In a few moments, I will introduce you to Mr. Trey Rotor, President and Founder of Rotor Consulting, and today's featured speaker. However, before we begin, we have a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to share with you. For those of you who are returning to our webinars, welcome. This should be pretty self-explanatory for you guys. And for those of you joining us for the first time, you guys are in for a very special treat. There are going to be approximately 1,000 people on this webinar, which means that we won't be able to hear all of your wonderful voices. However, we will be able to communicate with you in different ways. If you are a Twitterer, we are going to be tweeting, or I will be tweeting about this webinar. You can use the hashtag #ManageStakeholders. For those of you who aren't Twitterers or who just want to shoot us a quick question or comment, feel free to use the Q&A panel to the right of your screen. Should you have any technical difficulties and want to throw your computer out the window, which we advise not to do because I'm assuming you will need it after this webinar is over, please consider calling WebEx. They are fairly good at dealing with audio problems, video problems, the works. So again, please consider calling WebEx at 866-229-3239. At the end of this webinar, you will be directed to a link that has your free 1PDU form available to download, as well as today's presentation. You actually will have 3 opportunities to get this link. I will give it to you at the end of the webinar. WebEx will send it to you about 10 to 15 minutes after the webinar, and I believe after you close out of this webinar, you'll be directed to that page. So one way or another, you should receive that link. Now, this is a global webinar. As I mentioned, we have approximately 1,000 people on this webinar, spanning 6 continents, 45 countries. I wanted all 7 continents. Apparently no one in Antarctica wants to watch us, but if any of you are out there who know people in Antarctica, please tell them to come. We want Rotor Consulting to span worldwide on all 7 continents. Trey Rotor has a book out for sale. You can purchase it. It's called A Sixth Sense for Project Management. There are 3 ways to purchase it: through the Rotor Consulting website, through Amazon.com, and through BarnesandNoble.com. This book is available in hardcover and in electronic form. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Trey Roeder. Mr. Roeder is a recognized global expert on project management and organizational change. He has been quoted in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, MSN Money, Microsoft Press, Project Management Institute magazine, Crain's Cleveland Business, the list goes on and on. In his best book, A Sixth Sense for Project Management, the one I was talking to you in the slide before, Mr. Roeder details how to achieve project success by deploying a balanced approach with a particular emphasis on people. A dynamic and inspiring speaker, Mr. Roeder regularly speaks at global events, including the Project Management Institute's Global Congress, where he once received the coveted encore presentation. Mr. Roeder has been the host of the popular monthly global webinars, which routinely has anywhere between 700 and 900 people. Mr. Roeder founded Roeder Consulting in 2001 after serving as a consultant with Booz Allen Hamilton. He has successfully implemented strategies for Fortune 500 companies, mid-size and small firms. He is a member of the National Speakers Association, the Project Management Institute, and the American Society of Training and Development. Mr. Roeder is professionally certified as a project management professional. He holds a BA in economics from the University of Illinois and an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Trey Roeder.
Christina, thank you so much for that nice introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. If you've been with us before, welcome back. It's great to see you on our monthly global webinars. If you've never joined us for one of our global webinars, welcome to the team. We do these once a month. They're free. They're on topics related to the human side of change and project management, and they're typically around the second Tuesday of the month at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So wherever you might be, whatever time zone you might be in, whatever country you might be from, welcome to the Roeder Consulting Global Webinar. We look forward to talking to you today about project stakeholder management. At any point throughout this session, if you'd like to share a comment or a thought, or if you have a question, please go to the Q&A panel and share it there. We will pause about halfway through our hour together to do Q&A, and we'll also pause again at the end of the session for questions and answers. So you don't need to wait until that designated time period to ask your question. You can go ahead and put them in there as they come up, and we will address them when we get to the appropriate time. We work very hard to keep these webinars free. As you can imagine, the platform for 1,000 people across the world to be dialing in for live streaming video and also audio has some expenses associated with it. And we're very thankful for our sponsor, Twin Suns, who helps us keep these webinars free. If your company has several locations, your project management challenges are multiplied. You've considered cloud-based solutions, but where to start? Twin Suns are the experts in cloud workflow app development. Using QuickBase, the most reliable online data manager, Twin Suns delivers highly effective business solutions to Fortune 100 companies and startups alike. And solutions are in place in days or weeks, not months. Mr. Richard Crum, who is the president of Twin Suns, is a big supporter of what we're doing here at Roeder Consulting, and all of you who take the balanced approach to project management, where you understand business acumen, technical project management skills, including software, such as QuickBase, and also the interpersonal and people skills. I think you'll find him to implement in a way that is holistic and in tune with your organization. If you'd like to talk more to Rich or someone in his organization, you can reach them at 720-209-3385, or you can go to twinsunsolutions.com. Thanks so much, Rich, for your ongoing sponsorship of the Roeder Consulting webinar. Well, this is a very exciting time to be talking to you. It's very exciting because we are in the midst of a change in the profession of project management. Project management as a defined profession goes back perhaps as far as the months and years following World War II. When coming out of World War II, there were more complex pieces of equipment and machinery that were being developed, and they needed some sort of formal planning and scheduling to get a better handle on how to manage these projects and all of the different moving pieces. Then in the 60s, associations started to pop up that formally called project management a profession. So the Project Management Institute was founded in 1969. Some of the other larger project management associations were formed around that same time. And of course, this continues. In the early 2000s, Agile started to come on the scene as a very popular alternative to the waterfall way of managing projects. Well, for that whole time, since World War II up until recent history, project management primarily has been thought of as a set of technical skills and tools that are used. Things like project planning, things like PERT analysis, charters, work breakdown structures, Scrum meetings, and so on. All of these tools and processes are part of the technical fabric of project management. And that technical fabric is very important. However, we also know that the technical skills alone are not adequate to lead projects. It's the people skills that make the difference on whether a project fails or whether a project succeeds. The Project Management Institute is beginning to recognize that and is putting their money where their mouth is, if you will, by adding a new chapter to the project management body of knowledge, focusing specifically on people skills. More on that in a moment. First, let's start with our current version of the project management body of knowledge. For those of you not familiar with this document, it's about a 500-page document. It is the official doctrine of the Project Management Institute for the waterfall process, which is the traditional process of planning a project, then executing and controlling a project, closing it out, capturing lessons learned, and going back to start with planning. Well, the project management body of knowledge is currently on version 4.0, and version 4.0 did introduce an appendix that acknowledged the importance of people skills. We at Rotor Consulting, and I know many of you in the field, were very excited to see the introduction of Appendix G several years ago, because what this did is it formally recognized that interpersonal skills are critical to project success. You see on your screen here the words that show up in Appendix G on the left-hand side. Effective project managers acquire a balance of technical, interpersonal, and conceptual skills, Appendix G reads. And these skills help project managers analyze situations and interact appropriately. This is very close to the balanced approach that Rotor Consulting has been talking about since about 2006, some number of years before Appendix G came out. If we now look to the future, we are currently developing version 5.0 of the project management body of knowledge. Here's how this development process works. Around 2010, 2011, teams were pulled together from across the world, global teams, to write version 5.0 of the PMBOK. Then in 2011, reviewers were invited to take a look at what the teams had put together. And I was honored to be asked to review Chapter 13, a brand new chapter that was being put in place to focus on project stakeholder management. I took a look at that last year, provided my feedback, and then in March of this year, just a month or so ago, 2 months ago now, the exposure draft came out. The exposure draft is released to the community to take a look at this document. They turn it on for about 30 days where people can go into the website, the PMI website, they can take a look at the exposure draft, they can provide their feedback, and then the exposure draft is turned off. The feedback is incorporated into the final version, and around December of this year, version 5.0 will be formally released. If you missed that exposure draft, don't worry. Today, I'm going to share with you some of the things that are currently in Chapter 13 of the exposure draft. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this is preliminary. This is not the final document, so we'll share some of the words, we'll share some of the templates that currently show in Chapter 13, keeping in mind that that may not be exactly what ends up coming out in the final version of December. It's also important to note that if history is a guide, those who must take the PMP examination are likely to see version 5.0 around the middle of 2013. In other words, if you already are a PMP, you haven't seen Chapter 13. If you're working on your PMP right now, you haven't seen Chapter 13. But beginning the middle of 2013, any freshly minted PMP will now have this knowledge. So it's important for the rest of us to catch up with them and make sure we have this knowledge as well. Chapter 13 is called Project Stakeholder Management. And you see here on your screen a group of very happy, smiling stakeholders. Not exactly all the way this works out, but that is always our goal, to have happy, smiling stakeholders at the end of our project. Now, I'd like to start off with a survey here. Think of all of the stakeholders in one of your projects. Think of the executive sponsor. Think of the people on your team who are managing the project with you. And think of all of those individuals within the organization who are subject to this change. Now, on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a poll open up. And if some of those stakeholders, if some of those project stakeholders report directly to you, please indicate with a yes. On the other hand, as you think through your executive sponsor, your peers, the people in the organization who are subject to the change, the analysts and so on, if none of those folks report directly to you, please indicate with a no. Now, here's a comment about WebEx. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a screen that opened up that says polling on it, and it says poll question, do any of the stakeholders in your projects report directly to you? And there's a radio button where you can click yes or no. Now, when that screen opened up, it probably closed your participant panel that had the live streaming video. Now, this poll has just ended. It was a 45-second poll, so it's just ended. So it's going to go away in a moment here on your screen, and that video will probably open up again. If it doesn't, go to the blue bar that says participants. At the left-hand side of that blue bar, you'll see a little arrow pointing to the right. Click on that arrow. It will then be pointing down, and your video will then open up again. All right, so this poll has ended. WebEx has taken some time to tabulate the results, and Christina, thank you, has just shared those results. So what we see here is that of the people who are with us at the moment, 12% of you have stakeholders, some of the stakeholders reporting to you. 55% of you say no, with the remaining 32% not providing an answer. Let's ask you one more question now. We're going to open up another poll. It'll be formatted the same way. What level are you in your organization? And you see 5 radio buttons to select from. You might not fit exactly into one of these buckets. Pick the one that feels the closest to you. Are you a senior executive, a CEO, owner, president, managing partner, something of that sort? Or an executive, vice president, director. Many of you are in academia. Perhaps you're a dean. You're have some position of authority, administrative authority in your academic institution. Would you consider yourself a manager, team lead, supervisor? Some people who you have responsibility for, that would probably put you into the manager category. Or are you professional staff? We have about 5 more seconds on this poll, so select your answer now. And finally, administrative support staff. All right, this poll now has just closed out in the WebEx system. We will give it a moment here to tabulate results. And as soon as those results are tabulated, Christina will share those, and we'll take a look at the breakup of the group that's with us today. And I see from Christina across the table that that is imminent, and there it is. So of the group with us right now, we have about 1% senior executive, 5% executive, 35% manager. That's not surprising. I suspected most of us as project managers would consider ourselves in that category, and perhaps even some people with a program manager title Some of those folks would consider themselves a manager. Others might consider themselves as an executive, with 32% professional staff and very few people joining us today in administrative support. Thank you so much for your responses. Well, here's something that's interesting. The first question, stakeholders reporting directly to you. We asked that exact same question, phrased the same way in these webinars in 2010. And what you told us in that webinar is that about 76% of you did not have anyone reporting directly to you. So we had a little bit different number today, a lower number today. I don't know if that has to do with a change in the profession or with the makeup of who's on our call today. We can think about it offline here, and we'll be sure to let you know if we find out anything fascinating from this. The point, though, is whether you look at 2010 data or the data that we just captured, the point is we are very much a profession of people who must get things done through other people. Most of us do not have individuals reporting directly to us. So as we talk about project stakeholders, these are typically people who aren't reporting directly to us. And that means that we need a set of skills that enables us to manage and lead and control our stakeholders without having the luxury of holding their performance reviews, of being in charge of their compensation, their bonuses, and so on at the end of the year. So we need to move to a different skill set, a sixth sense skill set, in order to manage stakeholders. Let's go back to Chapter 13. For the PMBOK aficionados in the group, this is considered one of the knowledge areas. So the other PMBOK knowledge areas are things like project management risk, project cost management, project integration management. Now we also have project stakeholder management. The draft version of this is 11 pages long, relatively short compared to some of the other chapters in the PMBOK. However, interestingly, it does take the same process flow. So you have inputs, you have processes, and then you have outputs in Chapter 13. There's 4 subsections in this chapter. You see them here on your screen. 13.1 is identifying stakeholders. 13.2 is planning, how to manage them. 13.3 is then management. 13.4 is controlling stakeholder engagement in your project. Here's the definition, the current definition, again, subject to change. The current definition in Chapter 13, project stakeholders are individuals, groups, or organizations who may be affected by, perceive themselves to be affected by a decision, activity, or outcome of a project. Now, I think this is interesting, in particular the perceive themselves to be affected by. Do you have some folks who think they are stakeholders, but you don't consider them as stakeholders? Well, according to the broad definition that Chapter 13 is using, even if someone thinks they're a stakeholder in your project, that's now someone that we need to pay attention to. Now, like we always do with our courses, sometimes we find that a plain language definition is a little bit more helpful. So I'm going to turn to my good friend Bonnie Biafor. Bonnie's latest book is called Your Project Management Coach, and here's how she defines a stakeholder. A project stakeholder is anyone who has a vested interest in the project. There you go. We'll talk about how to manage these stakeholders in 3 categories. And for those of you who are familiar with Rotor Consulting and our 6 disciplines, you will immediately recognize here that these are 3 of the 6 disciplines: awareness, diplomacy, and adaptability. So as we discuss how to manage project stakeholders, we will talk about them in the context of these 3 Rotor Consulting disciplines. So let's start with awareness. Awareness is tuning your radar to yourself, to other people, there's our stakeholders, and to the situation, the overall situation that is influencing their stakeholders. Chapter 13 has some interesting grids in it. There's 4 different frameworks that are offered in Chapter 13 as a way to think about stakeholders. This is one of them here. This is one of the four, the power interest grid. So here's what you're looking at. In the vertical axis there on the left-hand side of your screen, you see power, high or low. How much power does a stakeholder have? On the bottom of your screen, you see interest with high on the right, low on the left. How interested is this person in your project? So the idea here is that someone might have a lot of power, but if they're not that interested in the outcome of your project, if they don't have that much skin in the game, you're probably going to manage them differently than the person who has a lot of interest and a lot of power. So here's the words we currently have in Chapter 13. Look at the top right quadrant. Someone with a lot of power and someone with a lot of interest. We're going to manage that person closely. We want to keep an eye on them. Someone with a lot of interest but not as much power, well, we want to keep them informed, but we probably don't need to manage that person or group or organization as closely as we would that high power individual or group or organization. Now, if someone loses interest, let's look at the top left. Even if they have a lot of power, but they're not that interested in the project, well, we want to keep that person satisfied. Because if that person decides, for whatever reason, that they're no longer satisfied, they're going to move to the right. They're going to move into a high interest, high power person. So we want to keep the person satisfied, and the individual or group or organization on the bottom left, they don't have a lot of power, and they don't have a lot of interest. They're still a stakeholder. They're still on the chart here. So this is someone that we need to monitor. And since all of us as project managers have limited time, limited bandwidth, Chapter 13 gives us the guidance to provide minimum effort. Not no effort, but minimum effort to these folks. Let's go to a real-life example to make this come to life. You see a picture here on your screen of something. If you know what it is, let us know. Go to the Q&A panel there. Where is this? This is somewhere in the world where I snapped this picture. I was there about a year ago. If you have exceptional eyesight, you can read on your screen on the white building where this is. Do we have some comments yet, Christina?
Oh, yes.
This is a sharp audience. I'm sure they figured it out.
Very much so. Everyone says the Panama Canal.
Indeed.
Actually, Andrea says Miraflores locks in the Panama Canal.
Way to go, Andrea. Either you knew that or you read the building here. Either way, bonus points. You're looking at a photograph from the Miraflores locks of the Panama Canal.
Read the building. Sorry.
Here's another photograph of the Miraflores locks. And what you see here are two lanes. This ship that you're looking at is on the far lane, and you can see that the water is going down. The ship is in the middle of a lock, so it's going from high to low. So it came in high, and now it's going low, and then we'll go at the end. And closer to you, on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you see another set of locks with the water higher. Today, the Panama Canal has two locks that you go through, two channels, two lanes that you can go through. Well, there's a major project underway where by 2014 there will be 3 additional locks added. So there will be a total of 5 lanes that ships can go through. And you can imagine how much of a difference this makes in terms of the capacity of the Panama Canal. About a year ago, I had the pleasure of going to Panama City and speaking at that country's Congress. And some of the people in my program are project managers of the Panama Canal Expansion Project. Well, think of all of the different stakeholders that these individuals are dealing with. They're dealing with the Panamanian government. They're dealing with international governments. They're dealing with vendors and contractors from all different sizes, doing all different sorts of things. They have the local community. They have environmentalists. One of the things that they've been very smart about is making the new set of locks more environmentally friendly. The current set of locks use fresh water. The new set of locks will be using more recycling of water. So a variety of environmental groups, from ones who are concerned about the land that's being torn up, to the use of water, to the air quality and so on, are involved with this. there are a lot of different stakeholders. So let's go back to our power and interest grid and ask ourselves, how might some of the Panama Canal Expansion Project stakeholders fit into this grid? Starting with the top right-hand quadrant, how about the government? The government of Panama clearly has a lot of power over this project and clearly has a lot of interest in this project as well. This is one of the main, if not the main, economic drivers of the city and the country. So the government needs to be managed very closely, high power and high interest stakeholder. Let's move down to the bottom right. This project, the Panama Canal Expansion Project, is thought by some to be a project that will reduce poverty by 30%, resulting in an 8% poverty rate in Panama after the 2014 expansion project. Now, if we take a step back and think about it for a minute, it's very exciting to me, all of the different things that we are involved with as project managers and how we are touching the world and touching society in so many different ways. So here's a project that's making a very real difference in the lives and prosperity of individuals in this region. So if you're an unemployed Panamanian, you have a lot of interest in this project. If you think it's going to lead to employment for you, you might not have as much power as the government, but you certainly have every bit as much skin in the game on the success of this project. So that's a group of people that we want to keep informed. Now, a variety of celebrities have made comments about the 2014 expansion project. And as we move over to the left-hand side here, a celebrity might not be as interested in the outcome of the project. If a celebrity makes a comment about the project, it's probably not making the dramatic difference in their life as it may for an unemployed Panamanian. And it may not cost you your job as it might be for the minister in government who's in charge of making sure that this thing happens within a reasonable budget or on time. Nonetheless, you have some interest in it. And depending on who you are and depending on how verbal you are as a celebrity, you might have high power or you might have low power. Let's take, for example, Roberto the Spider Vazquez. Roberto the Spider Vazquez is a boxing champion. He lives in Panama. He's a southpaw boxer. He's had 25 fights with 24 wins, a pretty good record at his projects. I don't think I'd want to be on the opposing side of him when we're fighting for stakeholders. Well, the Spider has come out in support of the Panama Canal Expansion Project. So here's someone, depending on how you think about it, depending on his voice with high or low power, and some interest in what's going on. So we at minimum want to monitor him, and if he has more power, we want to keep him satisfied. Because if the Spider decides for some reason he doesn't like the expansion project and decides to make comments about that, if he has a large following, if he's connected to some of the other groups, very quickly this could turn into a problem for you. Now, stop and think about this for a moment. We're talking about a professional boxer as one of the stakeholders to our project. Really? This isn't a person who's funding it. This isn't a decision maker. This isn't someone who's in the formal org chart on the Panama Canal Expansion Project. Yet, by any definition that we just looked at, it's someone with a vested interest. It's someone with influence. So as you think about your projects, I encourage you not just to think about the traditional people who are stakeholders, but think about those who have an influence, a voice, who may become a stronger voice in support or opposition of your project moving forward. All of these individuals and groups and associations are stakeholders for your project. Now, be careful to pay attention to cultural differences as you go through and figure out your stakeholders. This is a photograph I took in Germany. And as you may be able to read, if you have good eyes here, there's a P. This is a parking spot. And my German is not very good, but this says Frauenparkplatz. This is a parking spot for women. So if you're designing a parking lot in Germany, one of your stakeholders are females, and you need to make sure that that stakeholder group gets their own dedicated parking spots. And by the way, these parking spots are usually close to the entrance to the building. They also are typically close to the guard shacks if a parking lot has some sort of guard or security for the safety of the females. So this is a cultural difference. We don't see parking spots for women in the United States. You don't typically see them in many other countries. But if you are doing business in this place, as you think about the stakeholders, there's a real difference there. Just one of many examples of all of the cultural differences we need to pay attention to as we look at our stakeholders. Let's talk about diplomacy. Then we'll pause for questions, answers, and comments. Then we'll discuss the third section and pause for questions and comments again. As you manage your stakeholders, it's imperative that you exhibit the skills of diplomacy. Diplomacy is about unearthing common ground. Research study after research study shows that people respond to us as leaders of change, not just from the standpoint of results, but also from the standpoint of how we do things. What is the process we are using? Is it a fair process that we're using to manage our stakeholders? So what I'm saying here is that when it comes to project management, the research shows us the ends do not justify the means. And stakeholders are going to keep us honest, if you will. Stakeholders are going to let us know if they feel like they've been treated improperly. Now, I have a question for you as a group, and I truly don't remember the answer to this, so I'm hoping someone can help us out. We're now moving to the West Indies. We've been in Central America. We went to Germany. Now we're coming to the West Indies, which is just a little bit north of Central America. We're on an island. And the Atlantic Ocean is east of us. The Caribbean is west of us. And there's this creature here. I'm going to call him a mollusk. But my question for you is, what is this guy called? Who knows the name of this mollusk sort of thing? And we have a number of people with us right now from the islands in the West Indies. So I'm hoping someone can tell me the answer here. The right picture shows this. I'm going to call it a mollusk. The right picture shows us this thing stuck to the side of a rock. The left picture shows it in my hand, and you can see the bottom of it. So there's this, it might be hard to tell from the picture. It's sort of the consistency of chewing gum, and that's the surface that it uses to stick to the rock. Christina, has someone told us yet what the name of this is?
No one has.
No one has it yet. All right.
Well, I mean, there's no consensus. It's a limpid.
A limpid.
An abalone, a barnacle.
Abalone, a barnacle.
A snail.
Snail.
Barnacle. A chitin. So no one has come to a consensus.
Okay, great. Well, keep the answers coming. We're determined to figure this out. Here. What does this thing possibly have to do with project management?
No. I want to know.
Well, here's the deal. If you come up to this, I'm going to go with, what was the word, Lipkin?
Lipkid.
Lipkid? Lipkid? I don't even know.
Lipid.
I'm going to call it a lipid. It might be completely wrong. If you go up to this lipid mollusk creature thing.
Oh, a chitin.
A chitin?
A chitin.
All right.
Lee says a chitin. He even put Wikipedia.
Oh, way to go. Way to go, Wikipedia. Funny side story. One of my friends was recently telling me he was doing homework with his son, and a word came up that his son didn't know. So the father said, well, let's go to the dictionary and look it up. And the son said, yeah, we could do that, or how about Wikipedia right here on my computer? So thank you for going to Wikipedia, and it's called, what is it again?
CHITONS, a chitin.
A chitin, all right. If you walk up to this chitin, if you quietly walk up to it and gently pull it from the rock, you can pull it from the rock. However, if you walk up to the chitin and make a racket, there's more noise, you kind of fumble it and then try to take it off, what it does is it seals itself to the rock. And when it's sealed to the rock, you're not going to be able to get it off with your bare hands. You just can't get around it. You can't pull it off. So this creature, the secret to it is to be diplomatic in your approach. And people are the same way. if we come at our stakeholders in a more aggressive manner, how many times do we hear project managers saying, I needed to tell so-and-so that this is the way we need to do things in the project management office. I needed to educate this whole group on the way we need to have things happen. Well, I'm not saying that doesn't have its time and place, but the how we do that, the how we approach it, if we approach it like coming up to that creature making noise and saying we're going to fix this and fumbling around with it, they're likely to attach to that rock that they've been attached to for decades. On the other hand, if we're diplomatic, it's completely different. So what happens with people? Are we like that creature? Well, here's a fellow here in the picture. He's giving this young lady a piece of his mind. What do you think's going to happen? What happens in the real world in this situation? Yeah, right back at you, buddy. Right back at you. And now he's going, I didn't say it. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, these are our stakeholders. So we need to be diplomatic. We need to be sensitive. We need to be careful in our approach on how we go about getting things done. Otherwise, we may end up having the opposite reaction. The opposite reaction of having them cling even more tightly to that rock that they are attached to. We're now in a moment here going to pause for our first Q&A. So if you have questions or comments and haven't had a chance to put them in, now's the time. Bottom line here in diplomacy, avoid the fight. Avoid the fight. Don't look for fights. This goes back thousands of years. You may be familiar with Sun Tzu. He wrote The Art of War, a book about negotiation, diplomacy, and how to fight and win. Well, right up front, Sun Tzu says, to win without fighting is best. Let's go to Alexander the Great. The aim of Alexander's tactics, of course, was to win great battles. And that's what many people know him for. That's what the history books know him for. Alexander the Great won battles. However, the experts, including this gentleman here who wrote about him, say that his strategy, in fact, was to pacify and not to antagonize, hoping to limit the number of battles he had to fight. So the fewer battles we have to fight, the better off we are. Let's come now to modern day. One of the students in the class within the last year referred me to this book called How NASA Builds Teams. It's one of the things that I love about Rotor Consulting, our community, our LinkedIn group, our classes that we have in person and online, is that there's constantly an ongoing conversation. And I'm always learning from you. And a gentleman came up to me and he said, are you familiar with the book, How NASA Builds Teams? Well, I wasn't, but I bought it and I looked at it. And here's what Charles Pellerin says in his book, Avoid Power Struggles. He said, these are my two rules to managing stakeholders. I'm paraphrasing. And he says, number one, avoid power struggles. Number two, never power struggle if you don't have power. Well, what did we say right up front? And what did we see in our survey results? Most of us as project managers don't have these stakeholders reporting directly to us. So we don't have the power. We don't have that formal power. We need other tools and techniques that we can deploy in order to get things done. All right, let's come up for air for a minute here and see if we have any questions or comments.
We do. Actually, we have a lot of questions and comments.
Fabulous.
Andrea made a comment, the parking sign that you had, she said that it's reserved for women who drive by themselves, alone. So that was just
Thank you, Andrea.
Something very cool.
Okay, good to know.
And then Fred says, I agree, basic rule of project management, don't piss off the people you were counting on to do the work. So, good times.
Well said. We'll leave it at that.
Kristen asked the question, how can we adjust our stakeholder management plan when new stakeholders are identified mid-project?
Oh, great question. You know, this just came up this morning. I was sitting with an executive team this morning that was getting ready for a vote from the board of directors, and they were concerned about what about these board members who haven't participated in our meetings or our process up to this point, and they're going to walk into the meeting, and one gentleman used the analogy, it's like they're coming in the middle of the movie. Well, so the answer on how do we address them is it depends. It depends on that person and the situation and so on. So there's a diagnostic that you want to go through, and it's beyond the scope and the time that we have together today to get into those details. But the 30,000-foot, the high-level answer is when a new stakeholder enters your project, run through a diagnostic to figure out how they're going to fit in, what their interests are, what their skills are, how they feel about the project. And as you do that diagnostic, you'll get more information on how to integrate them into the flow, because this is very much the real world of project management. And you may have key stakeholders leave as well. This happens all the time, where our biggest supporters might leave the project. This is very fluid. Thank you for the question.
Pamela made a comment. She goes, another good example of knowing your stakeholders and the cultural differences is when Disney tried to open up other sites around the world. They found that it was not as easy as in the U.S.
Fantastic example. Euro Disney was very challenged compared to Disneyland in LA and Disney World in Florida, both of them very successful. Excellent point on how the model that works in one place may be absolutely the wrong model in another place. And that's something we talk about a lot, because we as a project management profession, we like standards. And standards have their place and time, but standards sometimes are the absolutely wrong thing to do, just like the Disney Corporation experienced when they tried to expand to Europe. All right, Christina's tapping on her watch, which, using my awareness, is telling me to move on. All right, so here we go. Let's go to adaptability, and then we'll have time for some more questions and comments, and we'll close things out. It's critical to, in fact, this is a nice segue from the question about what happens when a stakeholder enters the project midway through. We talk about the adaptability discipline, and at Rotor Consulting, the specific term that we use is a chameleon with a core. We as project managers must have a certain chameleon-like ability to adapt and adjust to what's going on around us. However, we also need our core. You see in the middle of this chameleon on your screen here a circle. That's his core. Our ethics, our integrity, our non-negotiables when we come to our projects. So when managing stakeholders, we must become expert on this adaptability discipline. Now we're going to talk about 5 different kinds of stakeholders. Rotor Consulting since 2006 has been teaching a buy-in course that uses the framework that you see on your screen here. Resist, unsure, support. In other words, as you think about the stakeholders for your project, they tend to fall into 1 of 3 buckets. Either they're resisting what you're trying to do, or they're supporting your project, or they're somewhere in between. They are unsure. This exact language has been picked up in Chapter 13. So in Chapter 13, you see the words resist and unsure and support with a brief definition of each of those. And you also see 2 words that have been added to this. One of them is leader. So leader, in a sense, is like a super supporter. The way this has been thought about in Chapter 13 as an expansion of this thinking on resist, unsure, support is a supporter is someone who agrees with the project but might not do anything about it. A leader is someone who not only supports the project but is verbally out there showing their support. They're doing things, they're taking actions, they're making speeches, they're making comments that are in support of your project. So in a sense, a really strong supporter. The 5th category that you will now find in Chapter 13 is this unaware. Now we tend to put them into unsure. People are unsure because they don't know what's going on, or because they know what's going on and they haven't decided how to react. Nonetheless, when you get a chance to flip through Chapter 13, you're going to see unaware as well, which is the person who just doesn't know about your project. They might be a stakeholder, but they don't even know they're a stakeholder yet. They don't know what you're trying to do. They're not on board. 5 different ways of thinking about stakeholders. It's also important as you think about adaptability. And by the way, in each of those 5, how you approach them is going to be very different. How you approach a supporter is very different from how you approach someone who's resisting. And by the way, how you approach someone who's resisting is very different depending on why they're resisting. Is it rational, emotional, or political? And there's a process that you can go through in terms of how you think through why someone's resisting, why a stakeholder is not supporting you, and then you tailor your reaction based on that. There is no one right or best way to handle resistance. There's a variety of best ways depending on what you're seeing. Let's talk about adaptability the other way. We just talked about what we can do to adapt to our stakeholders, depending on whether they're resisting or supporting. But the stakeholders are also going to adapt to you. In particular, they are going to adapt to the emotional scenery, the emotional landscape that you put around the project. If you are confident, if you are optimistic, the team will pick up on that. On the other hand, if you approach your stakeholders in a pessimistic, less than confident, concerned way, there's a lot of problems here, and I don't know what the answer is, you're going to have a different response because they are going to adapt themselves emotionally to you. Going back to this book on how NASA builds teams, Mr. Pellerin discusses how he was having a conversation with an executive one day, and the executive said, well, Charles, you're so confident. I can't believe you would think that you're not confident because you always come across as confident and you never seem to be afraid. To which Charles says in his book, well, I have fear, I have concerns, but what I've learned to ask myself is, what would I do in this situation if I had no fear? And that's what he tries to do. And that is contagious. The rest of his team perceives him as someone who doesn't have fear, as someone who is courageous in the face of adversity. By the way, this gentleman was in charge of the project that fixed the Hubble Space Telescope. You remember what was going on here with this Hubble telescope some years ago. It went up into space. It didn't do what it was supposed to. There were a number of missions trying to fix it. Well, he led the mission that finally got it to a better place. And you can imagine there was a lot of fear because that was a very high visibility project with a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of eyes watching. We're going to go back to some of your questions and comments. We'll have about 4 or 5 minutes for those, and then we will wrap things up. Here you see a picture of some of those PMPs in 2013 taking the new test, and they're learning about project stakeholder management. So again, a friendly bit of encouragement to all of you. Learn about Chapter 13. Become familiar with it, and incorporate people and understanding the human side of change into how you manage projects, because that's where we're going. We didn't have anything in the PMBOK, then we had Appendix G, now we have Chapter 13, and Chapter 13 is 11 pages long. We're still just scratching the surface. But this is where projects fail or succeed on the interpersonal side. We have an online course that will be debuting on advanced project stakeholder management. I'll be teaching this course personally. It will be July 20th and July 27th from 10 a.m. Eastern to 2 p.m. Eastern. This is on the same platform we're using right now. It's the WebEx platform. There's live streaming video. There's PowerPoint slides. There's chat. It's very interactive. The difference is we'll turn your microphones on, and we'll have a two-way conversation. We do limit attendance to the live online courses. Now, this webinar was capped at 1,000. That's the size of this room. For our online learning, we have a very, very much smaller number because we want to make sure we have open dialogue and exchange. So if you're interested in this class, please take a look at our website after this site, and I encourage you to sign up quickly before it fills up. We also have a variety of courses in your area, and I'll share that with you in a moment. And next month, we are going to talk about innovation. Next month, we'll be joined by Mr. David Offenkrantz. David is a PMP, he's an MBA, he has a master's degree, and he also is the former president of the largest PMI chapter in the world, the PMI Washington, D.C. chapter. He's going to share with us pieces of a presentation that he shared in Turkey last year talking about innovation and project management. I encourage you to sign up right away. This webinar sold out a week ago, so I encourage you not to wait until the last minute. You might find yourself in a situation where the seats have all been sold out. And here you have upcoming courses. We'll be in Richmond, Virginia in person talking about project stakeholder management in a little bit less than 2 weeks. We'll also be here in Cleveland, in Fort Lauderdale, and in Denver, Colorado for in-person learning. And we have online learning going on an ongoing basis. whether your PDUs expire this month or in a year, or whether you don't, you're not concerned about PDUs, but you're just looking to improve your abilities on the human side of change. We welcome you to our courses. Increasingly, we're finding more people who aren't PMPs or who aren't formally project managers. They might be a business analyst. They might be in a role that requires them to manage stakeholders, and they want to improve their skills and abilities in that area. Back to your questions.
A lot of great questions, a lot of great comments. Jerry from Wellsville, New York says, it's been said the golden rule is treat people how you would want to be treated. A sixth sense for project management should tell you to treat people how they want to be treated. Interesting.
Interesting indeed, yes.
Let's see.
I'm certainly not going to argue with the golden rule.
Okay, Cindy asks, how do you manage a project when everyone wants to be a stakeholder, but you cannot possibly manage that volume?
Yeah, it comes back to this language on how it's defined in Chapter 13, that someone who perceives themselves to be a stakeholder is a stakeholder. You know, I'd say if someone wants, let me say it this way. There's certain people who don't need to be stakeholders in the project. And part of our job is to figure out how to communicate that. So I don't believe the role of a project manager is to incorporate, everyone from every perspective who thinks they should be a stakeholder, because pragmatically, that's not realistic. So we need to put some sort of guidance on this. So how do we manage that person who wants to be a stakeholder? Well, perhaps what you can do is guide them to a different project that might be more in line with their skills. Perhaps you could meet with them once to get their thoughts and ideas and incorporate that in and let them know how you've incorporated that in, but then be clear that it's a one-time thing, that you have another core group that you're working with. It comes back to your awareness of the situation and your knowledge of this person. But I certainly do recognize that that's a big challenge we all have, people who fashion themselves stakeholders, but we really just can't manage all of these folks.
Lee asks, do you recommend a kickoff meeting that addresses stakeholders' power, expectations, influences at the start of a project?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. I love kickoff meetings. If you can do them in person, that's the best. If you can't do it in person, you can do them online, live streaming video, whatever you can do to make it as robust of a communication channel as possible. And to your point, I'm in agreement. One of the things that should happen in a stakeholder meeting is an open discussion with those stakeholders on what the expectations are, allowing those stakeholders to provide their own roadmap. What do you, in other words, as a stakeholder, think should be the rules of being a stakeholder? What do you bring to the table? How are you going to help the project? When should we talk to you? How frequently should we meet? And so on. And what you're doing is you're making them part of the process. Love the idea of kickoff meetings where you talk about specifically, explicitly, what the stakeholder engagement will be.
Thomas asks, going back to the power interest grid, how do you manage stakeholders who you assess as low power, but they insist that they are high power?
Well, the good news is, if they truly are low power, you don't have as much to worry about, because by definition, a low power stakeholder is someone who isn't going to be able to, it's going to be much more difficult for them to change your project. How do I manage that? Well, I don't like to tell people that they don't have power. That typically doesn't work out very well. So I'll listen to them. I'll be respectful to them. But going back to that grid, I'll monitor them. I'm not going to keep them as actively involved and as engaged. And if that ruffles some feathers, which it might, you might personally be able to have a conversation with the person, or it might be a good use of your executive sponsor. The executive sponsors can often be very effective in helping us clear the way around some of these interpersonal sort of stakeholder management issues where there's someone who feels like they should be invited to the party, but for some reasons maybe don't need to be there. Let's take one more question.
Fred asks, any advice that might apply to project managers who manage volunteers? at a nonprofit organization?
Boy, Fred, Rotor Consulting works with the Project Management Institute chapters. We have partnerships with more than 20% of the Project Management Institute chapters in North America. I think it probably makes us the largest partner to PMI chapters. And we see those chapters deal with that issue every day, because with very few exceptions, everyone working at the chapter is a volunteer. These people work very hard. They dedicate themselves to the chapter, but they also have day jobs. In most cases, they have families, they have hobbies, they have goals and aspirations and so on. And what I believe the key is to working with really anyone, but in particular this comes up more in a volunteer situation, is to join the stakeholders through a common goal, dream, vision, whatever you want to call it. But there's some sort of aspiration that brings a volunteer organization together. In a business setting, that's still the most powerful way to do things, but let's be honest here. The fact that the person's getting paid, the fact that the person might stop getting paid if they don't do the work is a pretty strong motivator. In the not-for-profit, in the volunteer sector, we need to be even more vigilant in terms of having that goal, that vision, unite people, and showing people how they can contribute. People want to contribute. People need to be shown how they can contribute in the most meaningful way, and that needs to be relevant within the context of how much time they have. And while you're doing that, constantly monitor, because you may have figured out something that gets a person actively engaged for a month or two, but then something might come up in their lives or something might change where they become less engaged. So constantly monitor the situation. Well, thanks so much for spending an hour of your day with us. We enjoy talking about stakeholders. We're thrilled to see Chapter 13 and other things that are happening in our profession, which is an increased awareness of the human side of change. If you're looking for additional PDUs, or if you'd like to learn more about a sixth sense for project management, you can find this book in a variety of different places, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble and our website. We've been really humbled to see this book make it to the top 100 bestsellers in the overall categories of leadership and management, as well as project management. I think it's a tribute to the fact that more people are recognizing what project managers do as a living, and the interpersonal things that we need to deal with are relevant to a wide variety of contexts, not just a project. Well, literally as the bell tolls across the street here at high noon, we bid adieu to Christina. Christina's been with us since day one of these webinars. She has been instrumental in behind-the-scenes setup as well as hosting them. Christina is professionally trained. She has a master's degree in youth ministry, and she's following her passion. She's made a whole-body decision following her gut and her heart and her brain to pursue youth ministry, and we're absolutely thrilled for her. So this will be her last webinar with us. She has several more weeks for us, and then she'll be returning to Virginia to take on that role. So Christina, thanks so much for everything that you've done and for all that you've contributed to these webinars.
My pleasure. It has been an honor to work with Rotor Consulting and with Trey, and trust me, I will be a frequent attendee on these webinars. I do thoroughly enjoy them very much, and I learn something new every time, every month. So thank you all for your support. Thank you for an amazing 24 months. It has just been absolutely unreal. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And for one final time, I'll hand off to Christina, who will share with you how to grab your PDUs. I wish you all the best for project success. We'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Okay, we are done. Thank you so much again for joining us today on managing stakeholders for project success. We hope that you learned a couple of nuggets here and there about how to manage your stakeholders. The link on the website or on the WebEx platform is rotorconsulting.com/postwebinar.php. You'll be able to download your free 1 PDU form and also this presentation. We hope that you will join us next week or not next week, next month for a Rotor Consulting webinar. Thank you.
Hey, bye-bye. Wave to Christina. High five. Well done. All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye.